This is Lesson 24-1, Industrialization and the World Economy. What were some of the global consequences of European industrialization between 1815 and 1914? College Board Topic 7.1 is Contextualizing 19th Century Perspectives and Political Developments. Explain the context in which nationalistic and imperialistic sentiments developed in Europe from 1815 to 1914. A variety of motives and methods led to the intensification of European global control and increased tensions among the great powers. Industrial and technological developments, the Second Industrial Revolution, facilitated European control of global empires. And we've got College Board Topic 7.6, New Imperialism, Motivations and Methods. Explain the motivations that led to European imperialism in the period from 1815 to 1914. European nations were driven by economic, political, and cultural motivations in their new imperial ventures in Asia and Africa. The search for raw materials and markets for manufactured goods, as well as strategic and nationalistic considerations, drove Europeans to colonize Africa and Asia, even as European colonies in the Americas broke free politically, if not economically. And European imperialists justified overseas expansion and rule by claiming cultural and racial superiority. Along this same topic, explain how technological advances enabled European imperialism from 1815 to 1914. The development of advanced weaponry ensured the military advantage of Europeans over colonized areas, and communication and transportation technologies facilitated the creation and expansion of European empires. Places China, Japan, and Egypt most notably, and that's between 1815 and 1914, of course, period 3. Key concepts of industrialization and the world economy. Neo-Europe, gunboat diplomacy, the Treaty of Nanking, the Suez Canal, and the Opium Wars. Key people of industrialization and the world economy. Muhammad Ali, we've met him already. Lin Zexu, Ismail Pasha, Colonel Ahmed Arabi, and Commodore Matthew Perry. Over the course of the 19th century, Great Britain and the rest of Europe expanded their economies around the world. Some of it was peaceful, orderly, and mutually beneficial. But if it couldn't be that way, things got ugly fast. If countries refused to trade or limited their trade, Europeans sent the military to force them. Europeans set things up so that they got the greatest gains from this new global economy, and this benefited the propertied classes back home most of all. The rise of global inequality. Before the Industrial Revolution, most countries were about equal in per capita wealth, income, and economic power, and we've talked about this before. Once the Industrial Revolution hit, a gap formed that went crazy. The non-industrialized countries didn't really start making gains until after World War II with decolonization. And even those gains were extremely modest compared to the huge gains that the industrialized world continued to make. Disparity of income creates much more disparity than simply how much money is in a person's wallet. Disparity follows you cradle to grave. It impacts such things as nutritional disparity, education disparity, healthcare disparity, hygiene disparity, transportation disparity, career opportunity disparity, and life expectancy disparity. There are two schools of thought to explain this disparity, and the first is the West simply made good use of its advantages to create massive wealth for itself. The West then reinvested that wealth in itself to create more wealth. And these advantages were science, technology, capitalism, and a rational, reason-based worldview. And what's so wrong about that? Who doesn't use their strengths and advantages in life? Aren't we taught to do that in school? The other school of thought is the West used its political, economic, and technical power to steal from the non-industrialized world. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle of this complex issue. Global trade wasn't new. Colonies weren't new. Feelings of superiority weren't new. Exploitation wasn't new. But now it was powered by three new things: the Industrial Revolution, extreme nationalism, and social Darwinism. The world market. Why was there a skyrocketing world market? Mass producers of goods need consumers to buy their products. It would be great just to sell to other industrialized nations. They have more money to spend. They have fewer cultural barriers. There's far less travel distance. But these other industrialized nations have the power to put up tariffs to protect their own industries. Non-Western countries can't raise tariffs against you. Instead, you can force them to sign trade agreements that prohibit them from doing that through coercion and through direct political control. Also, Europe is a big consumer of foreign goods, foreign raw materials and agricultural products and manufactured goods. Third, transportation costs were plummeting. Railroads were going up literally all over the world on every continent. Water transportation was also making huge leaps. A trip across the Atlantic went from 3 weeks to 10 days, and all of this meant lower prices for passengers as well as freight. The Suez Canal opened in 1869. The Panama Canal opened in 1914. Fourth, communication systems, telegraph cables. Transatlantic cables were dropped in the 1880s. Shipping could be totally coordinated by long distance. For example, if you have a ship going from India to New York, you can arrange for its next cargo to be picked up in New York and taken to Australia. And you can do it all from an office in London. There were massive amounts of foreign investment. Europe was accumulating huge amounts of wealth and cash, and who doesn't like cash? But cash is actually a pretty useless asset unless somebody puts that cash to work. In and of itself, cash doesn't transport stuff, doesn't make anything, doesn't serve anyone. It just sits there inert and stagnates. You need to invest it with people who have big plans for it. When they succeed, they pay you back with interest and dividends. From 1850 to 1914, massive amounts of investment capital were going to other countries and funding those countries' economic development. And that sounds great on the surface, but the majority of these investments were simply going to other industrialized Western countries. Non-Western, non-industrialized countries got relatively little investment. Also, a lot of this investment capital was going to neo-Europes. What is a neo-Europe? If you're living in the United States, you're living in one. It's a region where the topography and climate resemble that of Europe. 4 seasons, deciduous trees and conifers, mountains and lakes, temperate zones. For example, look at this beautiful photograph. That looks so much like Europe, but it's not. That photograph is actually taken in Paraguay. Some examples of neo-Europes: the United States, Canada, southern South America, southern Siberia, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand. Europeans were settling in these places by the millions. Only about a fourth of all this investment was going to places outside of Europe or neo-Europes. These neo-Europes also had native populations, and they were decimated by all of this economic expansion. The opening of China. China was a largely self-sufficient country as the Industrial Revolution took shape in the West. A look at the Chinese economy. They had advanced agricultural techniques. They had extensive mining and manufacturing equal to that of Western Europe. They had a huge population and therefore a huge consumer market. China also produced a lot of things that Europeans wanted: porcelain, silks, and especially Chinese tea. The English drank an amazing amount of tea. It's really difficult to trade with somebody who has lots of things you want, but who doesn't want anything you have. You wind up exporting all of your gold and silver to them. Everybody takes gold and silver. But then you have a trade deficit that's depleting your cash reserves. The Qing dynasty required that all foreign merchants live only in the city of Guangzhou, also known as Canton. They could only buy and sell to licensed Chinese merchants. Anything considered harmful to China was prohibited. And by the 1820s, British merchants had had enough of all of these Chinese regulations. British merchants also wanted access to that gigantic Chinese market for their manufactured goods. Thanks to the Industrial Revolution, their need for markets to sell all that stuff was huge. They proposed new trade agreements to China. British manufactured goods for Chinese manufactured goods. But China had very little use for European manufactured goods. European goods seemed really lame and useless to them. The Qing emperor even wrote to King George III and told him exactly that. He called British products like clocks and globes, etc., gadgets. And the British were really insulted by the emperor's blunt refusal to accept British manufactured goods. Then Britain found a solution to the deficit problem: opium, an addictive and dangerous drug. It was totally illegal in Britain, but this is China, so who cared? They arranged to start selling opium in China. This was through third-party traders and dealers, of course. They didn't want to look bad. By 1835, British merchants had 12 million Chinese addicted to opium. And British merchants used cash from the opium sales to pay for all the other Chinese products that they wanted. The fact that the British were selling to the Chinese something that was totally illegal in Britain was not lost on the Chinese. The Chinese government finally outlawed opium dealers as well as opium users. By 1836, the British merchants were aggressively demanding the creation of an independent British colony. This was in the name of, quote, safe and unrestricted liberty. And these merchants enlisted the support of the British government. They also got the support of the British manufacturers. The First Opium War. In 1839, the Chinese government decided to attack the problem at the source. They sent Special Envoy Lin Zexu to Guangzhou. He seized the opium inventory of the British merchants. Today, Lin Zexu is a Chinese national hero. Lin Zexu sent an open letter to Queen Victoria, which he published in Guangzhou. He demanded that she control Britain's merchants. The Times of London published it, but there did not seem to be an official response. At the time, many Chinese blamed Lin Zexu for starting the First Opium War. The British were outraged by this seizure of opium, and they declared war against China for daring to disrupt their opium trade. And this began the First Opium War, which lasted from 1839 to 1842. The British occupied several coastal cities and won the war. The steam-powered warship Nemesis was first tested in the First Opium War and found to be very useful, in other words, devastating. The Treaty of Nanking, 1842, ended the First Opium War. China was required to cede the island of Hong Kong to Britain forever. China had to pay $100 million in war reparations. They had to open 4 cities to unlimited foreign trade, and they had to agree to low tariffs. The Second Opium War, 1856 to 1860, resulted in even more concessions. This time, it was not only one country China had to fight. 17,000 British and French troops occupied Beijing. These guys intentionally burned down the emperor's summer palace. China had to give even greater trade concessions. They had to give up several more cities, and they had to accept trade and investment on unfavorable terms. Japan and the United States. Japan had practiced isolationism for the last 200 years. By 1640, Japan had decided to expel all foreigners from Japan. American and British whaling ships started appearing near the Japanese coast, and Japanese officials were commanded to drive away any foreign vessels. The U.S. forced the Japanese to trade in 1853. They sent Commodore Matthew Perry to open up trade with Japan. He had 4 steam-powered warships, which he used to impress, that is to say, intimidate, the Japanese. Here is a real photograph of Commodore Matthew Perry, and here is an anime of Commodore Matthew Perry. Japan had already seen what had happened to China, so they opened their doors to trade. Reasons given to force trade on the Japanese. Number 1, the safety of shipwrecked sailors. Number 2, the provisioning of whaling ships and China traders. 3, trade and profit. And 4, Japan should behave as a civilized nation. The word for this kind of intimidation is called gunboat diplomacy. Definition: the use or threat of military force to coerce a government into economic or political agreements. Interestingly, Japan had its first modern steam warship just 2 years later in 1855, the Maru. The Netherlands was the only European power that had a decent relationship with Japan, and the Dutch gave it to Japan as a gift and trained their sailors how to operate it. Western penetration of Egypt. What we see happening in Egypt became a new model of formal political control for the West. Egypt had been a part of the Ottoman Empire for a long time, and as we saw in a previous lesson, in 1805, the Ottoman Sultan appointed Muhammad Ali as the Wali governor. And Muhammad Ali strengthened and modernized the army in Egypt. He got new recruits, he got Western trainers, and he acquired modern military methods. Muhammad Ali reformed the government bureaucracy in Egypt. He improved communication lines. He brought new lands under cultivation. He brought huge numbers of Europeans to Egypt. 50,000 Europeans lived in Alexandria alone, and Europeans did all kinds of skilled jobs. Ali paid for it all with cash crops that you could grow and sell for cash. The peasants had been self-sufficient up to this time, but growing cash crops for somebody else's profit just made them poorer. Often they could not eat what they were growing. Nevertheless, Egypt was on its way toward modernization. In 1863, Ali's grandson, Ismail Pasha, became Wali. And in 1867, he got the Ottomans to recognize him as Khedive, viceroy. He wanted to continue to westernize Egypt. He sent prominent Egyptians to be educated in Europe, and he boosted cotton production. Pasha got the Suez Canal completed with French help, and the driving force behind the canal was this French diplomat, Ferdinand de Lesseps. Pasha modernized the city of Cairo. He had Western hotels built. He had wider streets built. Pasha made Arabic the official language of Egypt instead of Turkish. And Pasha made a bold declaration about his ambitions for Egypt. Egypt is no longer in Africa. We are now part of Europe. Unfortunately, you can easily succeed your way right into bankruptcy. By 1876, it became clear that there was no way Egypt could repay the enormous debt that it had incurred in order to fund all of these improvements. What about all that money that should have been coming in from the Suez Canal for them? The Suez Canal was owned and operated by an independent, publicly held company. Egypt had a lot of shares in the company, but Egypt had to sell those shares to the British in 1875. The British and French perspective on all of this was this: we've got investors back home who want their money. We've got economies back home that can't afford to let Egypt default on its loans. So France and Britain appointed commissioners to oversee Egyptian finances. And this was a new development in European imperialism. In China and Japan, Western powers had militarily forced these governments to open up trade and investment, and Western powers had done this through coercive treaties. However, in Egypt, there were these commissioners going in and controlling the day-to-day functions of the Egyptian government directly. So these British and French were running Egypt and making decisions for Egypt that favored the British and French first and Egypt second. The result was Egyptian nationalism. In 1879, Colonel Ahmed Arabi formed the Egyptian Nationalist Party, and Ismail Pasha, the Khedive, was forced by the British to abdicate from his throne. In 1882, there were deadly anti-European riots in Egypt. Here's a lithograph of Ahmed Arabi from Vanity Fair in 1888. He was a very famous personality. Hence, the Anglo-Egyptian War of 1882. This war lasted 3 months. The British Mediterranean fleet bombarded Alexandria, and Colonel Ahmed Arabi, also known as Urabi, led a revolt against the British, and the British invaded and put the revolt down. British forces temporarily occupied Egypt until 1956. The succeeding Khedives were puppets for the British. Foreign investors got their money back. The British improved Egypt's tax structure. Conditions for the peasants even improved. This financial tactic set a new precedent for Western imperialism. You can go into a densely populated country like Egypt, and you can do more than just force them to sign favorable treaties. You can force yourself into their very institutions and control their policies directly. All you need is an excuse. There are usually two convenient excuses. First, we need to protect our economic interests and our investors' money. Second, you need us to come in and teach you how to do things because you're really just children. You messed up, and now you need the grown-ups to come in and clean up your mess. So after Egypt, we see two kinds of Western expansion: economic expansion and political expansion.